Hello and welcome back to a third short video in the series on the introductory exercise 1. So I'm going to create a new part here and I'm going to do a third way of modelling this plate with two holes in it. Okay, so I've created a new part file. Again, I'm going to start with a similar procedure. I'm going to create a sketch on the top plane and I'm going to sketch the rectangle as before. So I'll use a corner rectangle. Now in this case we could use a center rectangle, but I'm just going to use the corner rectangle to keep it similar to the previous two examples. Again, as before, I'll use the Smart Dimension tool to dimension that rectangle 90 by 40. Left click on the line, left click to place the dimension, and then input your dimension 40. Okay, so this time, rather than creating the two circles and dimensioning them relative to the rectangle, so rather than using dimensions to locate the holes, what I'm going to do in this case is we're going to use some center lines and we're going to use symmetry relations to place the two holes to make sure that these two holes are symmetrical about the center line of the part. We'll use a dimension then, a center to center dimension on the two holes to give the spacing. Okay, so what I'm going to do to set that up is I'm going to create two center lines on the part, a horizontal center line and a vertical center line. So up here in the sketch tab we have the line tool, so you can draw a straight line, but if you use that drop down menu beside that, you can also create a center line. So a center line is it's a type of construction line, so it won't actually be used to create solid geometry when we extrude this later on. So you should be familiar with the idea of a construction line from your first year CAD courses. So what I'm going to do is, as I said, create a center line, and I want to draw that center line from the midpoint of this left hand side of the rectangle to the midpoint of the right hand side. So do that again. So drop down here, create a center line, and if you hover your mouse close to the middle of that line, you see the yellow icon indicating that it's going to put in a midpoint relation for me. So it's drawing a line from the midpoint of that rectangle to the midpoint over here, and you'll see it's putting in two automatic relations here, a midpoint and a horizontal. So this line here is going to be horizontal, and it's coincident with the midpoint of that line and the midpoint of this line over here. Now what that means is that later on, if we change the size of this, let's say if I change that dimension there to 50 for example, and it should update. So even if we change the size of this part later on, that center line will stay at the midpoint of the rectangle. I'll change that back to 40. Okay, so that center line is going to stay going from midpoint to midpoint. So that's the idea of these sketch relations here. So I'll do the same thing again. I will create another center line from the midpoint of the top of the rectangle to the midpoint at the bottom of the rectangle. Okay, and the next thing I want to do then is I want to place in my two circles. I could start with the circle coincident on that center line. I think I'll do that, and that will position the center of the circle vertically so that it's going to stay on this line. It's automatically put in a coincident relation there for me. Now you can do it that way, so you draw your circle, and if you hover over the center line, it'll automatically put in that coincident relation for you. But you can also manually add in that coincident relation yourself as well. So for example, if I had a circle that's located somewhere in space, I can select the center of that circle and then holding the control key on the keyboard, and selecting the line, I now have two things selected. I have the center of the circle and I have the line both selected. Over here on the left hand side then I can manually add in a relation. So I could add in a coincident relation or a midpoint relation. So in this case I want the center of that circle to be coincident with that line. So I'll add a coincident relation. Okay. So for now I have my two circles that are located on that line. Okay. Now the other thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that these two circles are symmetrical about that vertical center line. So what I want to do is highlight both of those circles and highlight the line as well. So if you click on the center of the circle, hold the control key on your keyboard, select the second circle, the center of the second circle, and keep holding control on the keyboard and select that center line as well. Okay, so now I have three things selected, the two centers of the circles and also the center line here. And I can add in a relation now, a symmetric relation over here on the left hand side. Okay, and you'll see this icon has appeared here. We have a little symmetry icon or symmetric relation. So what that does is it now means if I move one of those circles, the other one will move to match it as well. Okay, so they'll stay equidistant from that center line. Okay. So nearly there. The last thing I need to do now is to define the distance, the center to center distance of those circles. So I'm going to right mouse button and up, get my smart dimension tool, and I'm going to put a dimension in between the center of this circle and left click, and then left click on the second one, and I can put in a distance dimension there of 50 millimeters. Okay, and that should be, it's not quite fully defined just yet. I still have to put in the diameter of the circles. So I'll use the smart dimension tool again, make this 10 millimeters and 10 millimeters. Okay, and that should be now fully defined down here, so I can save the changes to that sketch and create my boss extrusion as before. So I want to extrude that from the sketch plane blind by 5 millimeters and click OK. Alright, so we have a plate here with two holes in it as before. It looks, at the moment, it looks quite similar to the other two, but as we'll see when we go to modify these parts, the three parts that we've created, although they look the same at the moment, the three of them will behave quite differently if you modify them. And that's something we'll discuss in more detail in class. Okay, so I'll stop the video at that, and thanks for watching.